This week's episode of Naked Mormonism is brought to you by $49 Sites. Visit $49sites.com and enter promo code NAKED to get a free upgrade to the Pro package.
Hi, I'm Eliza Snow, and I'm a poet. You didn't know it. No. And so, I was a renowned poet for a long time, and I lived in Kirkland, Ohio, but then I moved to Missouri and Illinois, and during that time I boarded at the Smith House, and in 1841 I started learning about the plurality of wives, and it was totally repugnant to me, and I just knew that would not happen during my mortal existence. So, but 2 months after that, I was sealed to Joseph, and in order to get through, I wrote poetry because my soul was always anxious. And when I lived at the Smith home, I was the tutor for the children, and I had other duties around the house. But then Joseph died in 1844, and I was completely heartbroken.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. It was a stressful time for the Mormons in Nauvoo. Joe and his posse had departed Nauvoo at the very end of December 1842 with Joseph Smith under arrest, headed to Springfield for a hearing which would determine the fate of the beloved prophet of the Mormon kingdom. The beginning of 1843 was already shaping up to look very similar to the end of 1838 with Joe in state custody attending court trials. Would the court grant his habeas corpus writ, or would it comply with the state constitutions of Illinois and Missouri and grant the extradition warrant, which would lead to Joe's death at the gallows? We read through the court transcript as it played out last episode, but that was happening in real time. The Mormons in Nauvoo had no idea what would happen while the hearing was underway. Their safety was currently at stake. None were more affected than the prophet's own wife, Emma Hale Smith, his own first wife. I suppose that distinction is necessary by this point. Thousands of Mormons were locked in a state of uncertainty. They had Joe's word that everything would go well, and his word was informed by his legal counsel, or if they believed him, by the will of God. But they could be wrong, and the Attorney General of Illinois may have the superior case. Nobody truly knew what would happen. Whenever Joe was absent from Nauvoo, it was up to the remaining leadership to keep the lights on. The presidency was responsible for keeping everything running smoothly when Joe was away from the kingdom. However, they were all with Joe in Springfield, with the exception of William Law, who remained in Nauvoo. The Quorum of Apostles took on heavier leadership duties when time necessitated, but they weren't the prophet or his counselors, and a lot of them were with Joe as well. Nauvoo catalyzed a shift for many Mormons. What I mean by that is Emma began spending more time in the spotlight as the mouthpiece of Joe when he wasn't available, or when he was, hiding out from the law. When people called on the prophet and he wasn't available, it was often Emma who handled his affairs in his stead. She was taking increased roles in land transactions as well, even holding property in her own name. Beyond that, she was the primary leader for half of the Nauvoo population. Emma was president of the Relief Society and looked to by thousands of women as the ecclesiastical leader of Mormon women within the kingdom. From Newell and Avery's excellent biography of Emma, Mormon Enigma, beginning on page 130, quote, "Because Joseph's attempts to avoid imprisonment forced him to be absent, many of the family business responsibilities fell to Emma. On September 23, 1842, she sold $343 worth of store goods. In June, Hiram Kimball sold to Emma and Joseph a 3/4 section of land, and Emma and Joseph together sold a city lot to a newcomer. By October, Emma bought and sold land without Joseph's supervision, but with his encouragement and approval. Emma interacted with church leaders in business. She wrote to Sidney Rigdon in September of 1842 about the way he ran the post office. The letter began with a polite but no-nonsense comment. I have noticed for some time back with feelings of regret that there is not that care and particularity in the post office in regards to the papers and letters belonging to Mr. Smith and the printing establishment that the nature of the case requires. Emma charged that unauthorized persons had been given Joseph's mail and had been seen examining, overhauling, and handling both letters and papers belonging to Mr. Smith, and opening and reading the papers, etc. She told Rigdon, "If this continues, we shall feel it duty-bound to make complaint to the proper authorities, considering it absolutely and indispensably necessary for the peace and interest of the community at large, as well as my husband's private and public interests. With sentiments of respect, signed Emma Smith." Rigdon answered that he gave papers only to persons asking for them from the printing office, and he declined to take responsibility for what happened to them afterward. Thus, Emma acted in behalf of Joseph and approached the problems directly. While some men deigned to respond to her, they did not always do so civilly. Rigdon's letter lacked the warmth of even the most formal salutation or closing. End quote. With all of this in mind, unfortunately for everybody, Emma had been rather ill since late September of 1842, largely confined to the Nauvoo homestead due to this illness. She could take callers, but she wasn't regularly attending Relief Society meetings for the last few months of 1842, and her ability to attend meetings which required her attention had also waned. People falling ill as seasons change is nothing new. Any Mormon journal, as well as a documentary history of the church, detail how rampant illness was, especially when it became cold. I mean, in summer it was mosquitoes and malaria in the swampland of Nauvoo. In winter it was freezing cold and the accompanying runny noses, coupled with nobody ever washing their hands, that drove people to the sickbeds. Emma specifically falling ill was nothing new either, but this illness was different. Once again from Newell and Avery in Mormon Enigma, commenting on how Joe was taking care of Emma during this most recent bout of illness. Quote, "Although Joseph did not become seriously ill, his own feelings of well-being rose and fell with Emma's. By Wednesday, October 5th, Joseph wrote, 'My dear Emma was worse. Many fears were entertained that she would not recover.' Violet Kimball described Joseph's anguish. 'Emma was brought down nigh unto death. Brother Joseph despaired of her life. He mourned over her and refused to be comforted. His sorrow was not only for himself. "Oh dear," he cried, "what will become of my poor children?" Emma was baptized twice in the river, which evidently did her much good," he reported. "She grew worse again at night and continued very sick indeed. I was unwell and much troubled on account of Emma's sickness." End quote. Emma was in a bad place as 1842 drew to a close. Luckily for Emma, she had the Lawrence sisters, a few young walkers, her secretary and dear friend Eliza Arsenault, and some other women living in the house to tend to her and the young Smith children during this bout of illness. Her afflictions were, unfortunately, resolved the day that Joe was departing for his trial in Springfield, December 26, 1842. From the History of the Church, Volume 5, page 195. Quote, "On my return home, I found my wife Emma sick, had another chill. She was delivered of a son which did not survive its birth." End quote. If the stress of everything happening in Nauvoo wasn't enough, a stillborn child, the day her husband left town under arrest, must have only added pain and anguish upon the stress. I mean, there was the overwhelming financial constraints weighing constantly on the first couple of Mormonism. Then we have Emma begrudgingly dealing with her husband's polygamy and how best to stifle the rumors. Emma having regular duties as president of the Relief Society was a constant time suck, which must have added to that stress. Emma had been sending and receiving letters from Illinois politicians and church leaders as a liaison on her husband's behalf, while trying to keep creditors at bay who were becoming more insistent with the Smiths' shoddy finances. To top it all off, Joe was wanted by multiple states. Sheriffs would come knocking on Emma's door while she hid her fugitive husband and searched the home for him. And now Joe was headed to the state capitol to answer for his crimes with hopes of being released, lest he face the death penalty in Missouri. All of this circumstances and this entire scenario must have significantly weighed on Emma's mind. It wouldn't be a stretch of imagination to conclude that this incredible weight of stress that none of us could possibly understand, right? It likely impacted her pregnancy. Further, she had just lost her son, Don Carlos, in September of 1841 when he was barely a year and a half old, and had buried another unnamed stillborn child in February of 1842. Now, 10 months later, she buried another child who didn't survive childbirth. No evidence can tell historians how far along this child was, but he was likely born prematurely with significant complications, which likely precipitated Emma's illness for the 3 months prior to the stillborn's birth. It was with strength and fortitude that Emma entered 1843, quickly recovering from her troubled pregnancy. Lucy Mack Smith, Joe's mom, had become a second mother to Emma by this point, her own mother having distanced herself from Emma. Some dispute exists as to when Lucy lived with her son and daughter-in-law, but by early 1843, Lucy Mack was living in the same household as Emma, witnessing her deal with all of these trials and stressors which would have crumbled a lesser person. Lucy penned this in her biography of Joseph the year after his and Hiram's death in Carthage. It's a small token that reveals how Lucy revered Emma's personality and strength during these trying times. This is taken from the Biographical Sketches, Liverpool, 1853 edition, page 169. Quote, I have never seen a woman in my life who would endure every species of fatigue and hardship from month to month and from year to year with that unflinching courage, zeal, and patience which she has ever done. For I know that which she has had to endure. She has been tossed upon the ocean of uncertainty. She has breasted the storms of persecution and buffeted the rage of men and devils, which would have borne down almost any other woman. End quote. Unflinching courage, zeal, and patience indeed. Emma was quickly recovering from the illness resulting from her failed pregnancy when Joe and his posse of 40 men returned to Nauvoo on January 10, 1843, victorious in the hearing we read through last episode. Joe and his council had prevailed, and he was released from the constant pressure of the Missouri officials wanting to play soccer with his disembodied head through the streets of Richmond, at least for now. A proper celebration was in order. As was the case with such victorious celebrations, the men sat around eating, drinking, and being merry, while the women slaved away to feed them all. Once again from Newell and Avery's Mormon Enigma, page 133, quote, On Tuesday, January 17th, Emma's house overflowed with guests who met for a day of fasting, praise, and prayers of thanksgiving for Joseph's release. At 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, they assembled again at the Smiths to celebrate. Eliza had written a new song, which the group sang with the warmest of feelings. Friends milled through the front rooms, while Emma and the girls in the kitchen made final preparations. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Emma and Joseph served 21 guests a hearty meal assisted by the Partridge sisters, the Lawrence sisters, and some of the Walker children. The table was cleared, and another group of 20 sat down to eat, Emma and Joseph still serving. 18 people ate at the third table, including Emma and Joseph. Then another 15, including the Smith children and the household members, were at the fourth. Joseph watched Emma move among the guests and supervised the work in the kitchen, then commented to the group, "This is not only a jubilee, but commemorates my marriage to Emma just 15 years ago this day." End quote. And what a commemorative day indeed. Emma and Joe's 15th anniversary was celebrated with dozens of friends in joviality for the recent court victory of the prophet. He prevailed over his enemies. The U.S. government and the anti-Mormon government of Missouri had no power over him. Pistolpack and Porter Rockwell, on the other hand, he was still hiding out in Pittsburgh, looking for work to try and feed himself. Emma's world began to settle back into the regular swing of things as January progressed into February. She was back to 100% by the beginning of February. Dr. Bob the Builder Robert D. Foster was making slow but steady progress on the Nauvoo mansion, which was eagerly looked forward to by many as a central meeting place in Nauvoo. Nobody looked more forward to the Nauvoo mansion's completion than Joseph. He had half a dozen of his wives living with him and Emma in the Nauvoo homestead, and it was getting cramped. Beyond that, Julia Murdoch Smith was 12, Joseph III was 11, little Frederick Granger Williams was about to hit age 7, while Alexander was now 4 years old. The Smith family was growing. Emma must have appreciated having these young women and her close friend Eliza Snow live in the home and help with chores and raising the kids. Further, Joe entertained a lot of company at his home on a daily basis. The women living in the Smith home were constantly feeding people who called on the prophet at a moment's notice for some business and then just happened to stay over for a meal. Logistically, the Nauvoo homestead must have been a bit of a challenge. The Partridge sisters probably had their own room and maybe shared it with the Walker siblings. The prophet and elect lady had their own room, and Eliza Snow may have had her own room, but probably shared hers with others as well. However, the home itself is surprisingly small. By home size standards of the day, it was comfortable, but modern Americans would scoff that upwards of 13 adults and 4 children all lived in a home of this size. Anybody who visits Nauvoo today, you can see the homestead and the headstones of all the Smiths who were buried in the garden adjacent to it. This home is a recreation based on the original plans and the footprint of the old home. Unfortunately, the original didn't survive the 175 years like some of the Nauvoo buildings have, but you really get a sense for how cramped it would have been there with nearly 20 people just by standing outside the home. Everybody was waiting for the Nauvoo mansion to be completed by Robert Bob the Builder Foster. To complicate matters further within the Smith home, Eliza R. Snow was apparently beginning to show with child. This was remarkable because she was one of Joe's first polygamous wives who had never married or wasn't currently married to another man when she and Joe were sealed together. When Joe took women to wife who were already married, resulting children could be easily concealed. Eliza Snow, however, was a different case. They had been married in June of 1842. Assuming she'd become pregnant soon after that, she could have been as far as her third trimester by February of 1843. Now, as best can be estimated by historians, in early 1843 or 1844, an altercation happened between Emma and Eliza Snow. The details of this altercation are shrouded in mystery and clouded by oral history folklore obscuring what may have happened. As the story aged, more details were added by people who were very young at the time or weren't even present to witness what happened. The most detailed account of this altercation came nearly 100 years after the supposed occurrence, and that was reported by somebody who was told the story by an elderly person who had recently died. This is one of those stories in Mormon history that historians have been wrestling with for over a century to figure out exactly what happened. A few assessments have been drawn which are relatively conservative, and we'll get to those momentarily. First, let's discuss the latest and most folklorish version of what happened in this incident. Then we'll discuss the historiography of how this story got to that point and what the record has to say of the incident. Quote, Charles C. Rich called at the mansion house Nauvoo to go with the prophet on some appointment they had together. As he waited in the main lobby or parlor, he saw the prophet and Emma come out of a room upstairs and walk together toward the stairway, which apparently came down center. Almost at the same time, a door opposite opened, and dainty little dark-haired Eliza R. Snow, she was heavy with child, came out and walked toward the center stairway. When Joseph saw her, he turned and kissed Emma goodbye, and she remained standing at the banister. Joseph then walked on to the stairway where he tenderly kissed Eliza, and then came on downstairs toward Brother Rich. Just as he reached the bottom step, there was a commotion on the stairway, and both Brother Joseph and Brother Rich turned quickly to see Eliza come tumbling down the stairs. Emma had pushed her in a fit of rage and jealousy. She stood at the top of the stairs, glowering, her countenance a picture of hell. Joseph quickly picked up the little lady, and with her in his arms, he turned and looked up at Emma, who then burst into tears and ran to her room. Joseph carried the hurt and bruised Eliza up the stairs and to her room. Her hip was injured, and that is why she has always favored that leg, said Charles C. Rich. She lost the unborn babe. End quote. It's a story that some of you may have heard before. Maybe you've never heard it. This Charles C. Rich of the Emma and Eliza pushing down the stairs incident. This Charles C. Rich account certainly contains some fascinating and salacious details. Fawn Brodie chose to homogenize many of the details in this story in her book No Man Knows My History, dating this incident to the spring of 1844, just a few months before Joe's death. This is what she says, quote, Of the 6 wives who lived for long periods in the mansion house, apparently only the 39-year-old poetess Eliza Snow conceived a child. She, as well as Emma, it seems, was pregnant in the spring of 1844. Eliza must have been torn between dread and the consequences and exultation at the prospect of facing the world, the mother of a prophet's son. It so happened that her bedroom in the mansion house was to the left of Joseph's, Emma's being on the right. According to tradition in the Snow family, Eliza emerged one morning at the same moment as Joseph, and he caught her to him in a quick embrace. At this instant, Emma opened her door and in a sudden terrible rage, for apparently she had trusted Eliza above all other women, seized a broomstick and began beating her. Eliza tried to flee, stumbled, and fell down the full flight of stairs. Still not content, Emma pursued her in a frenzy that Joseph was powerless to stop and drove her out of the house in her nightdress. By this time, the whole mansion house was awake, young Joseph and Alexander weeping and frightened at their mother's hysteria and begging her to be kind to the Aunt Eliza they adored. Joseph finally calmed his wife and indignantly ordered her to restore Eliza to her room and rights in the household. The fall, it is said, resulted in a miscarriage. After Joseph's death, Eliza married Brigham Young, but bore him no children. End quote. As was common with 1940s history books, Brodie's book is a bit light on the footnotes, but the appendices provide some sources of her information. In Appendix C, we find what documentation Brodie used to reconstruct this story. This is beginning on page 470 of No Man Knows My History. Quote, "There is a persistent tradition that Eliza conceived a child by Joseph in Nauvoo, and Emma one day discovered her husband embracing Eliza in the hall outside their bedrooms, and in a rage flung her down the stairs and drove her out into the street. The fall is said to have resulted in the miscarriage." And this is the citation that matters. "This tradition was stated to me as fact by Eliza's nephew, Leroy C. Snow, in the church historian's office, Salt Lake City." End quote. Indeed, that account that began with Charles C. Rich, that Rich account that I read before, reading from Brodie's book here, was from Leroy C. Snow. Leroy Snow was nephew of Eliza and the last remaining son of Lorenzo Snow, fourth prophet of the Brighamite Church. Leroy Snow was a church historian until his retirement in 1950, while Brodie was compiling No Man Knows My History. She very likely did hear this story directly from Leroy. Thus, she introduced the story by saying, according to Snow family tradition. That's an important detail. She possibly even examined his source. But what source was Leroy referencing with all of those details that he attributed to Charles C. Rich? Well, the details of how Leroy came into contact with this story are surprisingly interesting. Leroy was 11 years old when Eliza R. Snow died at the age of 83. Now, it's a bit of a stretch to think that Eliza personally told the story to her 11-year-old nephew on her deathbed or any time prior to that. However, Leroy was 25 years old when Lorenzo Snow died as prophet of the church in 1901. Leroy may have heard the story from his father, but if that were the case, why would he attribute those details to Charles C. Rich instead of his own father in the account? Charles C. Rich died when Leroy was just 7 years old, so he certainly didn't hear that story straight from Charles Rich himself. No, this account by Leroy Snow that he attributed to Charles C. Rich actually comes from an 11th August 1944 letter from W. Aird MacDonald, who served a mission under Charles Rich's son in the early 1900s, from whom MacDonald likely heard the story. So, to summarize, the details of the Charles C. Rich account that Eliza was pregnant, that Emma saw Eliza and Joe kissing, that Emma threw Eliza down the stairs, that Joe picked up Eliza and laid her in bed, that Emma ran to her own room weeping, and that Eliza miscarried her pregnancy as a result of all of this. All of those details come from a fourth-hand account written more than 100 years after it supposedly happened. It's not what we'd consider a trustworthy source. However, there are interesting details to the story not included in this account, which somewhat tarnishes the notion that it was fabricated based solely on embellished older accounts. Fawn Brodie also included another minor detail in Appendix C after that last passage that I just read. Now, the context in which this detail specifically that I'm about to read is added is quite fascinating in and of itself. A man named Solon Foster was coachman for the prophet periodically in Nauvoo, who was supposedly present to see this take place. The details from Solon Foster were passed on secondhand to John R. Young, son of Brigham Young, who recorded these details in his own journal in 1928. So 1928 dates this nearly 2 decades before the 1944 letter that described the Charles C. Rich account. So John R. Young heard Solon Foster relate these details in a sacrament meeting in Salt Lake City when Joseph III and Alexander Smith were visiting the Utah Mormons in 1876. This was happening in a time that they were investing allegations of their father's polygamy. This is when Joseph III was prophet of the RLDS Church, and he was trying to expunge his father's name from any accusations of polygamy. So this is what Solon Foster's account adds to this story, and this is from No Man Knows My History, Appendix C, page 471. Quote, Solon Foster, coachman for the prophet, was present in the mansion house when the incident occurred. Years later, he met Emma's sons, who were then publicly denouncing polygamy in Utah, and reproached them for their attitude. Joseph, the night your mother turned Eliza R. Snow into the street in her nightclothes, you and all the family stood crying. I led you back into the house and took you to bed with me. You said, I wish mother wouldn't be so cruel to Aunt Eliza. You called her aunt because you knew she was your father's wife. He did not deny it. End quote. Now, once again, this is a second-hand account. It's not fourth-hand account, as the Charles C. Rich account is. And it's given roughly 80 years after the supposed occurrence instead of 100 years. It also adds some details that are absent in the Charles C. Rich account, namely that Joseph III, at age 11 at the time, was outside the house with the rest of the family when Solon Foster brought him inside, and that's when he told Solon he wished that Emma wasn't so mean to Aunt Eliza. Foster's account also adds that Eliza was in her nightclothes, which is another word for pajamas, which were essentially underwear at the time. Now, this contradicts the Charles C. Rich account, as the Rich account takes place in the morning, whereas the setting for the Foster account is late evening, when he took Joseph III upstairs and tucked him into bed for the night. So both the Foster and the Rich account are not directly from the people who gave the accounts, but they were passed to historians after their deaths by later people who had absorbed the story and wrote it down long after it happened. So where did the story actually come from? That's an important question. If Emma pushed Eliza down the stairs and caused her to miscarry, when did that crop up? Where did that story come from? And it's an important question because stories like this don't just come out of nowhere with people seeking to verify their truth, right? The story had to exist in some form somewhere for people to know who to ask about what had happened. To trace the story back into the 19th century, we are forced to go to an 1886 expose of Mormonism. And we'll get to that after a break and a quick word from our sponsor, $49sites.com. Hey, everybody. Do you remember something from the backlog of the podcast, but you just don't remember when it happened? Yeah, when did we talk about Mormonism and Masonry? When did that happen? When was the Disorderly Persons Trial of 1826? Well, how did the Kirtland Safety Society start? How did that all come to be? Well, if you have any ideas of something that we've talked about in the past, but you're not sure when it happened, quickest way to do that is to go to nakedmormonismpodcast.com and enter in the search bar keywords that you're looking for. That crawls all of the show notes for the show and aggregates them into a list where you can find the episode and the content you're looking for. How did this all come to be? Well, this super handy search tool is courtesy of $49sites.com. What is $49sites.com? Well, what you do when you sign up at $49sites.com and you use promo code NAKED, you get added onto their starter package. And you, because you use the promo code NAKED, you get an upgrade to the pro package. So what exactly is $49sites.com? Well, what they do is they create a web service where they will host your website. They will optimize it for mobile sites. They will design it with a specialized professional designing team. They'll increase your search engine optimization. They'll create engaging web content. They even add in professional copywriting, so that's something you'll never have to worry about. They add in contact forums and stock images and unlimited updates. And the best part is there's no startup costs. So if you have a website, or if you need a website, if you have a company or you have a blog, if you have something that you need a website for, don't try to do it yourself and spend so much time learning the basics of putting together a super basic website. Instead, hand it over to the professionals at $49sites.com. Now, I personally have had the Naked Mormonism podcast website revamped by $49sites.com, and you can see it for yourself. It's super easy to use. And the most important part, as people are transitioning more away from desktop and laptop computers and moving more towards mobile devices, they make sure that everything looks good on a mobile browser. So if you are using a mobile website and the buttons are in the wrong spot, you never have to worry about that with your website if you go with $49sites.com. But if you use promo code NAKED, you also get upgrades with Google Analytics, entire photo galleries, sliders with extra photos, promotional pop-ups, Google Map integration, text animations, SSL certification. You get a ton of extra features for the regular price. So if you're needing a website, go to $49sites.com and enter promo code NAKED and you get that free upgrade to the Pro package. Once again, $49sites.com, use promo code NAKED. With that, back to the show. To understand where this Emma and Eliza staircase story came from, we next turn to Wilhelm Ritter von Wymetal in his respectable 320-page 1886 expose of Mormonism. This was published by the Salt Lake Tribune in Salt Lake City, titled Joseph Smith the Prophet, His Family, and His Friends. Now, this expose was packed full of incredibly controversial claims of the prophet and the origins of Mormonism, detailing physical intimacy of dozens of Joe's extramarital affairs, and many of those were not women who were ever sealed to the prophet. And I'm sure that we're going to be reading through this on the NAPO Book Club in the Patreon feed eventually, but it's a really important book. So this is what Wymetal told of this relationship between Emma and Eliza leading up to the supposed altercation that happened where Eliza was pushed down the stairs. This is beginning on page 57, and you're going to find a link to this on archive.org in the show notes. From Wilhelm Ritter von Wymetal, quote, Miss Eliza R. Snow, one of the most curious figures in the history of Mormondom, played an important part in the events relating to celestial hymnology. She is a great poetess, and such a poetess, in parentheses, and is a sort of high priestess, generally, of Mormonism. She used to anoint the sisters in the endowment house and play the part of Eve in the celestial drama enacted there. She is now over 80 years old, yet doing the same thing in the Logan Temple in Utah. Sister Eliza became the church's elect lady, he's inferring replacing Emma here, when the Lord became thoroughly incensed with Sister Emma for her contumacy. She is the very prototype of what is called female roosters in Zion, always ready to enslave and drag men and women into polygamy. She was one of the first willing victims of Joseph in Nauvoo. She used to be much at the prophet's house, and Sister Emma treated her as a confidential friend. Very much interested about Joseph's errands, Emma used to send Eliza after him as a spy. Joseph found it out, and to win over the gifted young poetess, he made her one of his celestial brides. End quote. So now that Wymetal set the scene for the relationship among Emma, Eliza, and Joe, he finally gets into the story of Emma supposedly throwing Eliza out of the house. Quote, There is scarcely a Mormon unacquainted with the fact that Sister Emma, on the other side, soon found out the little compromise arranged between Joseph and Eliza. Feeling outraged as a wife and betrayed as a friend, Emma is currently reported as having had recourse to a vulgar broomstick as an instrument of revenge, and the harsh treatment received at Emma's hands is said to have destroyed Eliza's hopes of becoming the mother of a prophet's son. So far, one of my best informed witnesses. Her story becomes corroborated by another reliable source. End quote. The scathing nature of Wymetal's book and the circumstances under which this expose was published definitely calls the veracity of this story into question, especially as this was more than 4 decades after the supposed occurrence, and he simply cites unnamed best-informed witnesses and reliable sources. That's it. That's all he gives us. Eliza R. Snow was alive at the time that this was published, but she was so old and feeble that she spent most of her time, traveling around or sometimes confined in the home. Now, Wymetal could have called upon her to question her of the story, but why would Eliza Snow give him the time of day? He was an antagonist of the faith, and she was arguably the most powerful woman in Utah at this time. Eliza spent most of her life in Mormonism as royalty. As to how pervasive the story was, Wymetal chose to include it, claiming that nearly everybody knew the story. He says there is scarcely a Mormon unacquainted with this story. He was in Utah interviewing all of these people. He would know, right? But what does that mean? That just simply means it was an oral tradition that he wrote into his book. Now, what is quite interesting of this account is what is on the page prior to this story of Emma using the quote-unquote vulgar broomstick as an instrument of revenge on Eliza Snow. This is the detail. Quote, Eliza Partridge, one of the many girls sealed to the prophet, used to sew in Emma's room. Once, while Joseph was absent, Emma got to fighting with Eliza and threw her down the stairs. That finished my sewing there, Eliza used to say. End quote. So, Wymetal's book never claimed that Emma threw Eliza Snow down the stairs, but that she threw Eliza Partridge down the stairs, who was then probably 17 years old. However, the detail of Joe picking up whichever Eliza it was who tumbled down the stairs and then carrying her up to bed, that wouldn't conform to it being Eliza Partridge, as Wymetal explicitly stated that Joe was away from home when this altercation between Emma and Eliza Partridge took place. According to Wymetal, Emma's treatment of Eliza Partridge also didn't involve the vulgar broomstick, quote-unquote, but whatever did happen supposedly rendered Eliza Snow unable to ever bear children again. However, there's nothing in Wymetal's book to conclude that Emma possibly threw Eliza Snow down the stairs that resulted in the miscarriage, only that she maybe caused Eliza to have an abortion with a broomstick, which is pretty messed up in and of itself, but maybe would explain why she remained childless her entire life, despite being wife of a man with more than 50 children. But once again, readers may have falsely harmonized the Eliza Partridge and the Eliza Snow fights with Emma from Wymetal's story all into a single story and then applied it all to Eliza Snow. Needless to say, Wymetal's book was full of salacious accusations and tale that paint Joe as a much larger human than he really was. Some of the claims and reporting in it are considered trustworthy, but only when corroborated by outside sources because it's incredibly antagonistic. Now, these two stories were oral tradition in Utah that Wymetal printed in his book, which, by virtue of being printed in a book, turned them into fact for a lot of people. However, oral tradition does not equal truth. So the question remains, what outside sources exist to corroborate or debunk that Emma and Eliza Snow had a fight that resulted in Eliza tumbling down the stairs and miscarrying hers and Joseph's child? Wymetal didn't have access to many documents that historians can have access to today. Beyond that, the Charles C. Rich account recorded by Leroy Snow in 1944 that we read to kind of start this whole scenario off, that fourth-hand account was more than a century after it happened, but Leroy Snow didn't have access to documentation that historians have today. Have supplemental studies found any veracity in this story? That's a great question here, right? First, let's try and deal with dating this supposed occurrence to see if it's even possible that a timeline would allow for such an incident to occur. Now, Fawn Brody dates this incident to early 1844 in the Mansion House, but Eliza Snow didn't live with the Smiths in the Nauvoo Mansion. She lived with them in the Nauvoo homestead until February of 1843, when she went to live on the Morley settlement in Illinois. The Smiths didn't officially move into the Nauvoo Mansion until August of 1843. If this altercation did happen, it must have happened in the Nauvoo homestead house in early 1843, likely between January and February, before Eliza moved out. Now, other historians have placed it in spring of 1843, possibly May, but that was after Eliza had moved to the Morley settlement. Now, this altercation doesn't require that she lived with the Smiths at the time. You know, she could have just come over and stayed the night with her husband away from her own home. However, Eliza living with the Smiths until February of 1843, That would be the most reasonable time to date this whole stairs incident. Now, neither Brodie nor Leroy Snow had access to Eliza Snow's Nauvoo journal, which she kept periodically from June 1842 to summer of 1844. Now, Maureen Ursenbach Beecher's work has been crucial to historians seeking to understand Eliza Snow and her Nauvoo journal. What has Beecher's study of Eliza's Nauvoo journal unearthed about this supposed time period for which an incident could have occurred? Well, I'm just going to briefly read from a 1982 article Maureen wrote with Avery and Newell, the authors of Mormon Enigma, Emma's biography. And, of course, Maureen Beecher is the author of Eliza R. Snow's, centerpiece biography. Now, this is what she wrote concerning this incident. Quote, Eliza's journal itself gives not a hint of either a pregnancy, unless, quote-unquote, delicate constitution be construed to mean delicate condition, quote-unquote, which was a 19th century euphemism for pregnancy, or an altercation with Emma at any time during that 6-month stay. One cannot read anything into Eliza's terse note of her departure, quote, took board and had my lodging removed to the residence of Brother Jonathan Holmes, end quote. The next entry, dated 17th March, 1843, shows Eliza ceremonially closing the school that she taught since 12th December, 1842, quote, having the pleasure of the presence of President Joseph Smith and his lady, end quote. During the period of Victorian prudery, no woman would have ventured forth unnecessary, much less have taught school once her pregnancy was evident. Certainly, the account attributed to Charles Rich does not square with the dates in the journal. Either Eliza would have been pregnant when she moved in with the Smiths, allowing her to have become, quote-unquote, big with child, by the close of her sojourn there, so that she could not have taught school, or she would have had to have conceived afterward, allowing her to teach school for the few months early, but not giving her time to become, quote-unquote, big with child before she left the Smiths. In any case, the report she kept of her class shows her own perfect attendance during her school, a record she could hardly have maintained had she miscarried during that time. And, as has been noted, her school continued a month after Eliza moved in with Jonathan and Elvira Holmes, end quote. So, Eliza's own Nauvoo journal offers no evidence to corroborate any altercation between her and Emma. But this is Victorian prudery, as Maureen Beecher puts it, so maybe she never would have included something like that if it did occur. But beyond that, her activities of school teaching don't really leave an opening for her to have been pregnant with the prophet's child, or for her to have spent time recovering from a late-term miscarriage. Essentially, Eliza's own journal leaves little to no room for this fight to have occurred in early 1843. Now, that's not to say that it couldn't have happened and it simply wasn't recorded, because that's entirely possible. The point I'm making is Eliza Snow's journal doesn't mention it at the perceived time, nor does any of the documentation she left behind at the time really allow for it to have happened, but it could have. Now, a hypothetical could be constructed here. Maybe she was only beginning to show us pregnant, then it happened on a weekend after she closed the school and when she was on a conjugal visit to the Smith home or something. There's plenty of holes in Eliza's timeline for her to have missed a weekend from the public eye for her to recover from the miscarriage. Although moving the incident to after she moved out of the Smith home in February of 1843 definitely introduces more questions than it solves. So Eliza herself didn't leave any documentation behind concerning this incident. What about sources other than Eliza Snow? It turns out that William Clayton, scribe to Joseph Smith, recorded a very interesting entry into his journal in May of 1843. Now, this entry concerns Eliza Partridge, though, not Eliza Snow. Here it is. Quote, President Smith stated to me that he had had a little trouble with Sister Emma. He was asking Eliza Partridge concerning Jackson's conduct during President's absence, and Emma came upstairs. He shut to the door, not knowing who it was, and held it. She came to the door and called Eliza 4 times and tried to force open the door. President Smith opened it and told her the cause, etc. She seemed much irritated. End quote. This is really the only entry in a contemporary journal which allows for some kind of altercation to have occurred. But importantly, this mentions nothing of stairs, a broom used as a weapon or abortifacient, personal injury, or Joe's lack of ability to control the situation until after the harm was done. None of the later details in the Charles C. Rich account or the Wilhelm Wymetal 1886 expose are present here. It was just an argument between Joe and Emma concerning Eliza Partridge, not even Eliza Snow. So what sense do we make of this? Well, let's look to some historians here. Okay, so Todd Compton dealt with the historicity of this issue rather conservatively in his book In Sacred Loneliness. This is on page 315. Quote, "To sum up, something may have happened between Eliza and Emma, and Eliza may have lost a child. Without further evidence, it is impossible to know for certain. The multiplicity of versions inclines one to suppose that an authentic incident lies behind them, but they are so late and second-hand that one mistrusts their details. However, they do point to a possibility, and if Eliza did lose a child, the experience would have been psychologically devastating to her." End quote. Newell and Avery's biography of Emma deals with the incident even more conservatively. This is on page 136 of Mormon Enigma. Quote, "Whether Eliza fell down the stairs, or whether Emma pushed her or pulled her down by the hair, or whether Emma only turned her out of the house, the result seems to be documented in Eliza's terse journal entry for February 11th, 1843. Quoting Eliza Snow's journal, quote, "Took board and had my lodging removed to the residence of Brother Jonathan Holmes." End quote. Both Emma and Eliza had known Holmes's wife, Elvira Cowles, since they had arrived in Kirtland. Elvira Holmes was treasurer of the Relief Society, and she would become Joseph's wife in less than 3 months. Eliza did not make another entry in her journal for 5 weeks and wrote no explanation for either the gap in her diary or her abrupt departure from Emma's home. End quote. And then finally, an article published by BYU Studies with Newell and Avery of Mormon Enigma fame as co-authors with Maureen Ursenbach Beecher as the primary author. And this is even more conservative in its reporting of the supposed incident. Quote, "The anecdote is told orally more often than it is written, with details of time, scene, costume," one account has Eliza in her nightclothes, "action, motivation, and results being adjusted according to the attitudes of the teller. As generally related, it takes the form of a short story with setting, plot, and characters, and it displays the characteristics of easily defined formula fiction. The characters are good or bad, their motives oversimplified, the action predictable, the results inevitable. It is the stuff of legend, a folk tradition, perpetuated orally and likely to continue. For the student of Mormon culture, the prevailing questions about the story are, why was it told, and why is it still told? What does this telling say about the tellers? What truths of the human heart, their own human hearts, do people reinforce through the telling? But for the biographers of Joseph Smith or Emma Hale Smith or Eliza Roxy Snow, there is a more awkward problem. How did the story get its start, and which details, if any, are based on fact?" End quote. The article, and you'll find it in the show notes, and everybody, the show notes this week are particularly fascinating. If you are looking for further reading on this subject, they are, there's a lot in the show notes. I'd recommend you check it. If this is a subject that fascinates you, or, just listen to me read it. The article does conclude with this historian's safe haven. And this safe haven that I'm talking about is very common in conclusions of essays dealing with such folklorist stories, especially in Mormonism. Now, the final line in this feels like typical BYU Correlation Department editorializing, which sort of denigrates the conclusion as a whole, but regardless, it's still relevant, even with the get out of paradox free card that's invoked at the end. Here we go. Quote, "So there we are. But where are we? Faced with a folk legend with genuine documents that tell no tales and dubious ones that contradict themselves in the contemporary accounts, perhaps it is best for us to respond, as we must, to many paradoxes of our history. Consider thoughtfully, and then place all the evidence carefully on the shelf, awaiting further documentation or the millennium, whichever should come first." End quote. And that's the last paragraph of the article. Now, Emma seeing Eliza Snow and Joe kissing her and Emma pushing Eliza down the stairs after beating the hell out of Eliza with a broomstick, resulting in the miscarriage of Eliza's child. It's folklore. Okay? But as Compton said, there's so many versions out there as an oral tradition. It has survived so successfully in the collective Mormon mindset that it's hard to conclude that a nugget of truth doesn't underlie an incident of some sort happening here. Now, whether or not it happened is an interesting question, which we've spent this episode exploring, right? Historians simply can't conclude one way or another. It's clearly folklore, legend, if you will. The documentary evidence doesn't corroborate it, but there are plenty of holes where such an incident could have occurred, and we also wouldn't necessarily expect to find such an incident documented. I mean, lack of evidence doesn't mean something didn't happen. It just means that nobody can prove that it did happen. You know, there is a lot of ambiguity in the historical record, which lives in this realm of historical plausibility, and that's where this story lives. It's folklore that lives in the realm of historical plausibility. With that said, Beecher, Avery, and Newell did ask some important questions that are worth exploration. Why was the story told, and why is it still told? What does the telling say about the tellers? What truths of the human heart do people reinforce through the telling? How did the story get its start? First, is it plausible that Emma and Eliza had a falling out of some kind in early 1843? Just consider all of the stressors weighing on the elect lady of Mormonism that we discussed at the top of the episode. And beyond all those outside pressures, Emma was dealing with some powerful inner turmoil surrounding her husband and polygamy. She'd been dealing with Joe's libertine nature their entire marriage, but he had well over 24 wives by early 1843, only some of which Emma was privy to the knowledge of. Plus, she just had her second miscarriage in a year, only a month before this supposed altercation happened. Then she has, a rough day for any number of reasons. It's hypothetical, of course, probably because of stuff that Joe was doing at the time. And then she sees Eliza and Joe share a heartfelt kiss in the hallway while Eliza is showing with Joe's baby. How would that make Emma feel? Emma was never really known for rage or for cruelty, but the historical record reveals she would occasionally lose her composure when it was just too much. And I'm not justifying violence, I'm simply saying, is it plausible that Emma had an outburst like this towards one of her closest friends and sister wives, which may have precipitated a quick break at that point? Of course it's plausible. Of course it's possible. How much pressure was she under? Anybody, any reasonable person could have had an outburst at something like this, right? She was under so much pressure in Nauvoo. She was running the female side of the church. She was brokering business and land deals. She was meeting with politicians and church leaders to try and secure her husband's freedom so that he wouldn't be executed by the state. And beyond all of that, she was taking care of 4 kids and had just buried 3 of her own children in the past year and a half. Joe had another 24 partners at this time as well. What kind of signal did Joe send to Emma to know that her husband could spend nearly every day of the month in a different bed with a different wife? I mean, obviously, she didn't know the extent of his sexual deviancy, but she had some ideas, and she had to deal with the fallout of incredibly pervasive rumors spawning from the Nauvoo rumor mill. She had every reason to be mad or harbor feelings of jealousy against Eliza Snow and Eliza Partridge. The thing is, historians will simply never know if Emma did act out against one of them and push them down the stairs. My point is, if it happened, it shouldn't be a surprise. Now, on to possibly the more salacious aspect of this story. Why was the story told, and why is it still told? When Wymetal included the story of Eliza Snow and Eliza Partridge in his 1886 expose of Mormonism, this story was a prolific oral tradition in Utah. Why? Because the Utah church had done everything in its power to absolutely destroy Emma's legacy. The RLDS and LDS churches have only recently been on friendly and collaborative terms. That's only been the case for the last half century. Leonard Arrington and Robert Flanders were crucial to building bridges between the religions beginning in the 1960s and 70s, but prior to that, the religions were diametrically opposed with competing one true religion succession claims which couldn't be reconciled. The RLDS have always held Mother Emma in very high regard, but Emma and Brigham Young hated each other. The first time Emma appeared in a Brighamite church published article in a positive light was in 1978. 1978. That's the first time, that's a century after her death, before the Brighamite church finally spoke favorably of her, and it was only done so in tandem with praising Lucy Macksmith as well. Now, the most plausible explanation for how a possible altercation between Emma and Eliza grew and morphed into this oral tradition and folklore is simply character assassination perpetrated by bloody Brigham Young. No single person has had more of a hand in shaping Mormon history and the way that we view the characters within that history than Brigham Young himself. He had a vested interest in Emma being seen as untrustworthy and opposed to everything the Brighamite Church stood for, which at the time was polygamy. What better way to assassinate Emma's character than to spread a rumor that she viciously attacked one of the most beloved and powerful women in Utah solely because Eliza was one of Joe's plural wives who was showing with his child? That turns Emma into the adversary of everything the Utah Church stood for. This Stairway story made Emma the villain, the adversary, anathema to everything the Utah Church sought to live and practice. I mean, think about it. It's compelling. It's exciting. There's anger, vengeance, blood, heartbreak, tragedy, crying children, and so many aspects woven into the story that it can't help but cause personal attachment and interest. And the best part about folklore is it can be easily tailored to the audience without being tethered to those pesky little things we call facts. Folklore is a set of comfortable lies that we pass on to teach a lesson. It's why religions are so pervasive and generational. What's more important is examining the underlying lesson behind the folklore and examining why that folklore was created in the first place. For that reason alone, the next time this story comes up, if that ever happens, I don't know what kind of circles and people you run in, but it sure does with me. Maybe take a second to step back and ask the important questions. Did Emma push Eliza down the stairs in a fit of rage? What evidence are you basing that story on? And then to the important questions, why would Emma have done such a thing? What could have motivated her actions? Why has this story been circulated and who's telling it? Why did it gain traction in the first place? Those are the questions which lead to deeper discussions that actually give these one-sided characters depth and meaning. The villainous devil Emma pushing the helpless little pregnant Eliza down the stairs in a fit of jealousy. That's the stuff that legends are made out of. What set of circumstances caused these two incredibly close friends to become enemies overnight is when we dip our toes into the nuance and complexity that makes us human. That's the lesson we should take from Emma's Stairway to Hell. All right, that's going to do it for today. Of course, if you've listened to the last couple of episodes, you know that we are trying to help out Brother Jake on the GoFundMe /GoJakeGo. If any of you don't know who Brother Jake is, just type that into a YouTube browser and prepare to laugh. Brother Jake unfortunately had a cardiac event of some kind, and he is currently conscious. He's doing a lot better than he was just a couple weeks ago, and the family is trying to raise funds in order to help with the who knows how long of rehabilitation that is going to come along with his healing process over the next few years through this. So they have a $40,000 goal, and they are trying to raise that here by the end of January. We're just about to crack 30 grand on this, $30,000 to help out the Frost family who's in need of this. And, it's unfortunately just one of those facts of life where it's an unexpected, totally out of the blue type of health situation. And, it's kind of one of those things that forces you to realize that a state of health is a temporary state of living. So if you have the ability or if the desire to help out the Frost family and Brother Jake, go over to GoFundMe.com/GoJakeGo, just like Phil did, friend of the show Phil. He just recently donated, sent me an email that he doesn't want to be written into a treasure dig like the last half of the last episode was. So that's totally cool. I respect your wishes, but also just want to thank you for donating, Phil. Haven't had any other entries. I'd love to put some of you guys into a treasure dig just like we did with last episode. Trust me, I have read up on enough of them to know that there is plenty more types of roles and scenarios I can manufacture out of these. And, of course, hidden meanings and everything peppered in. So if you're interested in being written into a treasure dig or having your likeness drawn into a treasure dig just like our last entrance did in last episode, 5 entrants, you can send an email of your confirmation receipt to donate to Brother Jake at nakedmormonism@gmail.com. Of course, if you donate $50 or more, you get written into a treasure dig. If you donate $100 or more, you get your likeness drawn into a treasure dig. So with that to look forward to, feel free to sign up. It would be awesome if you did. If not, then that's totally cool. Now, to move on to some other house cleaning, we haven't read off new patrons in quite a while, and I kind of feel bad because y'all are helping me to produce the show. You guys are keeping the lights on here at Ground Gnome Studios. So on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, we have new patrons, Bird Lawyer Esquire. I thought that is just simply delightful. We have Adam. We have a pledge edit by John, a new pledge by Rodrigo, Jan, Christina, Edward, Don, Josh, Jesse, Sarah, and a pledge edit by Jeff. So to all of our new patrons, as well as our pledge editors, thank you so much for pledging to support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And of course, you get extra episodes every week. Every Monday, you're getting Nemo Book Club, you're getting Nemo Home Evening, you're getting all kinds of extra content, as well as the Patreon-only episodes, the ad-free editions of the episodes, as well as extended. After the credits, I like to just kind of flip the mic on and just chat for a little while, whatever happens to be weighing on my mind, Mormon-related, not Mormon-related, what I did last week, whatever, it doesn't matter. So a bunch of extra content just to reward those who do pledge to support at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and of course to all of our patrons over all time that this podcast has been going. Thank you so much to all of you. One last announcement. I don't know if I've said this on the show recently, but if you're interested in current events related to the church, go check out the Glassbox podcast. That's where I'm covering current events, and we're doing Mormon Leaks Minute and all of these extra segments that kind of grew out of Naked Mormonism. They were all transferred over to Glassbox podcast. This next week, we're going to be airing episode 14, which Braden and I talk about the recent changes in the temple ordinances and try to put that in a little bit of historical context. But of course, there's a lot of really fun content over there. So if you're looking for one more podcast to add to your weekly, or in the case of the Glassbox podcast, the semi-weekly feed, go subscribe over there. Love to see you over there. Braden and I sure have a lot of fun covering topics inside and outside of Mormonism, just, whatever might interest you. So with all of that said, of course, I want to say thank you, everybody, to all of you who hit the download button every week and keep coming back and keep on our historical timeline. It really means a lot that you're sticking around. So thank you to all of you, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.